Hey everyone, it's Kevin, and thanks for following my reporting on the Julian Assange extradition trial. I'm the managing editor for Shadowproof. We've been at this for over 2 weeks now, giving people daily updates this way, also putting out written reports that are available at dissenter.substack.com, and also the coverage that we are publishing is at shadowproof.com as well. There's been a lot of you out there who share the live updates from court and also are engaging with this reporting. I really appreciate all of you. We've got a couple questions. If you have any questions about what has been unfolding with Julian Assange's case and the extradition trial in particular, feel free to drop any kinds of questions here, and I'll get to them after I give a summary of what happened on day 11. This was an important day. We moved into another part of the evidence for the defense's case. That is the medical evidence, the evidence that Julian Assange's health has deteriorated, the mental health risks that he would face if he is brought to the United States and put on trial. We heard from Professor Michael Koppelman. He's a forensic psychiatrist. He is someone who seems to have a pretty good relationship with Assange, at least better than some of the other doctors, which relates to evidence that we heard. And Koppelman was put on the stand to address issues like the clinical depression that Assange has been diagnosed with, the risk of suicide that might present itself if brought to the United States, and how the U.S. government is targeting him for his political opinions. And essentially, that first persecution, what that would mean for his health as this continues, as the U.S. prosecutors continue to push this unprecedented case against Julian Assange. That was something that Koppelman could speak to from a medical perspective, not from a political standpoint. And so we had the cross-examination, or we had the initial questions that were laid out by the defense. They get about a half hour. They get to go through his submission to the court, which was a full report on Julian Assange's health. This is a doctor who visited and met with Assange from May 30th, 2019, onward on into, I think, the end of 2019. And so he was giving his recollections of how he had diagnosed different behaviors that Assange has exhibited. Just a quick note that we were asked by the defense to be sensitive about what was described in court. I made a judgment in what I was sharing related to his personal medical records that I don't have any urge to share the kind of medication that he may or may not be taking. I'm not sure that that has any bearing on whether or not he will be extradited. There's also some other things maybe related to whether or not he has Asperger's, and it wasn't quite nailed down for me in the testimony. So rather than speak in inexact terms about whether there is, in fact, a diagnosis or not, and whether or not it factors into what would happen, I'm just going to speak in a positive sense rather than a negative sense about what is and what was presented by Koppelman, and what we can really latch onto rather than speculating about these different areas that might be issues for Assange medically. So, that's just a kind of wordy way of saying that, Koppelman addressed things like he had complained to him, Assange had complained about hallucinations, auditory, suggested that he was hearing music. So that's one thing that I'm willing to share, and it's a very specific thing that was dealt with in the testimony. So I think it's important for us as we engage with the case to talk about that. And that these hallucinations would definitely relate to somebody who is in a moderate or a severe depressive state, as Julian was diagnosed to be in. And specifically, as it was laid out in the timeline, we have that Koppelman found that Assange's condition was severe through December 2019 after being removed from the embassy in February, March, and 2020. We have that it becomes more moderate. And then with COVID-19 lockdown, it becomes more of a critical issue. So severe once more for him. There was a notation that there was some increased depression around 2015, 2016 in the Ecuador embassy. But again, Koppelman didn't personally treat Julian Assange, so he can't exactly say what was going on. There's no mathematical prediction in all of this, was something that was stressed by Koppelman as far as whether someone really would commit suicide if brought to the United States. You can't really predict that as a doctor, but you look at all the factors and you try to add them up and say what would happen. And so then come the afternoon, come after that, we were still in the morning of the proceedings. Come after that, we had what was more than 3, maybe a little less than 4 hours of cross-examination from the prosecutors. They had a lot of time to talk with him. He was able to go, I think it was more like 3, but they had a lot of time. They spent 3 hours about with this witness, I think, when you break it down in terms of the day. And so they cross-examined Koppelman and started asking him things in order to disqualify his testimony, making it seem like he was biased for the defense. Has been a standard tactic. But I think James Lewis, the lead prosecutor, was particularly aggressive with Koppelman today, especially as Koppelman tried to explain his views and explain why he had diagnosed Julian Assange in certain manners. I noted that there was a pressure throughout for Koppelman to change his diagnosis of Assange during the court proceedings, which seemed improper. And in fact, Koppelman resisted this pressure to alter his conclusions based on these relatively meaningless points that James Lewis was trying to make, that he thought should be given more gravity than I would give. For example, we heard later on in the cross-examination that Julian Assange is engaged with the court proceedings. He is responding to what is happening in the courtroom. He is consulting with his attorneys. Wouldn't that suggest to you that he is not in a moderate or severe depressive state? And Koppelman said, no, not really, because this is semantic knowledge. It doesn't suggest that he would still have issues with cognitive memory. He would still have issues with who knows if everything that's happening in these proceedings he's able to recall if you asked him right now. All of the stuff in these proceedings relate to events that unfolded between 7 and 10 years ago. So there's nothing that says that you would have a tough time processing that now. I mean, the issue is, what does he remember from the case that is being brought against him and what is happening daily at the Old Bailey courthouse? And so he resisted this push to suggest that his diagnosis was somehow biased. He mentioned the other doctors that he had assessed Julian Assange's state, and this is the way he feels. There was something that came up about a concealed razor blade. I know that it appears this has been reported in the press previously, that it's been given some coverage, and it would seem that there was a razor blade, like a standard one that you would use in prison, that he happened to have. It's not clear yet. There's some more to be put on the record by the defense about what went down when this was found. He self-reported it. He volunteered the information to doctors, and then he had 4 days in isolation for it. but it's not clear that he ever intended to use it to hurt himself. There's actually conjecture on the part of both the defense and prosecution, so I'd like some more clarity as I speak about this. But certainly, this was a part of Koppelman's psychiatric evaluation. That he might be hoarding pills, that maybe he might be collecting cords, that any implements that he might be putting in places and hiding so that he could use them on himself to commit suicide is something that he was supposed to assess, right? As the doctor, that is important for him to do. There are tidbits throughout, but I find myself more taken and baffled by the prosecution and the way they handled it more so than the defense, because I know what the defense is going to put on. Every bit of evidence we got from the defense was essentially the kind of standard information that would need to be put on the record to persuade the judge not to approve extradition, because his life would be put at risk if he was sent to the United States, and with his deteriorated state of mental health, he would be put in conditions of isolation, and he would likely try to commit suicide because he is removed from his family. His partner, Stella Morris, and his two children are living in London. His father probably wouldn't follow him to the United States. He lives in London. Family in London or back in Australia even. So he's still dealing with that separation. And so So I'm struck by the way that the prosecution was handling it more so than what the defense had to present. Nonetheless, there were some interesting details that were shared. But for one, I was very blown aback by this idea that keeping Stella Morris private was somehow some kind of a ploy to deceive the judge and make it seem like she was unbiased and not someone who was Julian Assange's partner. But the public didn't learn about Stella Morris being the partner of Julian Assange and that she had two children with him. We didn't learn that until months ago. It was this year. And so this doctor prepared his reports for the court without revealing identity. He showed empathy. He kept that confidential. He didn't believe it was necessary. He mentioned, Stella was already known as someone close to Assange, who was part of the legal team, who had done some work as a kind of advocate before anyways. So if we're talking about bias, there already would have been reason for the prosecutor to attack her just because she had some affinity to the WikiLeaks team. So then Lewis was really upset and angry, and I didn't think it was warranted for him to be that worked up about keeping Stella Morris's identity from the court, and now they know, we're having this extradition trial. It's a moot point. It really isn't even an issue because it's right there for everyone to read. So we know it. There was some stuff related to a son, I believe, a son that not the two children he recently fathered, but an earlier son. And Koppelman kept some details vague and nondescript, or he left them out. But that is a person who has a private life and apparently has had some significant issues because of the fact that his father is Julian Assange and the way that Julian Assange's reputation has been attacked. And so anyways, there were details that were left out, and Lewis objected to leaving that material out as well. There was, there's also the fact that at one point it got, in my view, very, very petty because he just ended up rattling off all these things that Julian Assange had been able to do in the last 10 years that should suggest he wasn't suffering from depression, like soliciting classified information from the US government, which is the indictment, consulting with media organizations on these releases. He even mentioned and described it as a chat show, what he had on Russia Today, where he'd interviewed people like Rafael Correa, who eventually, of course, gave him the political asylum to be protected from what he is going through now. And so again, the tenor of this cross-examination was somewhat sleazy and even kind of deceptive in the way that it was being presented to the judge. And the witness Koppelman was very wise to it and tried to manage it, and at various times objected. And the judge said the judge registered his objection, but asked him to comply and answer the questions. There were exercises that we did that made the cross-examination longer than necessary, because we were asking him whether he could remember certain details. There was like a quiz show that was played in the early part of the cross-examination that I felt was mostly unnecessary. It doesn't go to what's happening with Julian Assange at all. I think this is one of those cross-examinations where it seemed more about breaking down the witness and getting them to say that 2 + 2 = 5, rather than it was trying to rebut or undermine the defense's case, because there were a lot of tricks and ploys, it seemed, that they were trying to attempt in order to show that Koppelman wasn't fair, even though he's very respected and has some experience with these kinds of extradition cases, providing evidence in them. And so, yes, I would largely agree with you, Allison, that the prosecution is wasting our time. And in spite of the fact that the judge has complained about the defense not having its act together in organizing the witnesses, we still see the prosecutors getting what I think time and time again is an extra hour that isn't needed to get through their evidence. They're going to put their case on. I understand it. They're going to defend their indictment, but the way that they're doing it is sometimes unnecessary, because, again, one thing we repeatedly hear from the judge as press following this trial is that she has the submissions in front of her from the defense. The defense does not need to read from them. Logic says that she also has the same material from the prosecutors, so we don't need a quiz show about how the actual psychiatric tests are to be performed. And you don't have to, and unless you're going to actually contest a doctor's knowledge and suggest that he doesn't know what he's talking about, then move on with it. Ask him about his assessments of Assange so we can get to what really matters in the case. Get to what you grapple with and don't agree with that he has done, so we can, really address these issues. The defense came back with some re-examination. They didn't get at much more, but a few interesting things did come out at the end there, which was that Julian Assange, in fact, had spoken in one of the consultations about Chelsea Manning. It was close to when she was going to get out on bail. I'm not entirely clear on the date, but it doesn't really matter, because he was aware that she's in the facility at Alexandria Detention Center that he could potentially go to and be incarcerated in pretrial confinement, or be held there in pretrial confinement. She attempted suicide, and that didn't sit well with him, because this is where he's going to be, and it's not very reassuring that that kind of thing is happening in that facility if that's where you're going to go and be held in pretrial confinement. All these reassurances about protections don't go over too well when that is happening. There was another example that was given by Koppelman about how he was part of a case where he had assurances that everything would go fine in the prison at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, and that this person who was going to be extradited, everything would be okay. And then it wasn't long after that Jeffrey Epstein was found dead inside of that facility. So again, the reassurances don't really make a whole lot of sense when this is what is happening. And this idea that there are going to be suicide protocols and they're going to protect people, it does not seem like the Bureau of Prisons or anyone in the U.S. government is really engaging in reality when they ignore what has happened in these examples. So that about does it for today. We have more medical evidence that is coming, that there will be multiple psychiatrists that testify on day 12, which is tomorrow on Wednesday. And this is the evidence that we will hear for the bulk of this week. We heard that they're figuring everything out as far as the calendar. There are about 14 witnesses for the final week that I don't know how they're going to get all of them done, completed, but they're going to try. We'll probably have longer days. And so, and those witnesses are going to be on an array of issues. I don't know that they're going to fit a certain area like they have so far. They've been pretty organized in the way the defense has presented some of these issues. And I think that might be changing. Let me get some of your questions before I wrap up and get on with some putting together the written report that I'll do today on this testimony. I'm not exactly sure what angle I will focus on, but I might go back and look a little bit closer at some of the notes I took during court, see if there's anything I can flesh out more fully. I was asked, is he still being x-rayed every day? I have no news to share in that regard, so I imagine it's all the same as Stella Morris's partner has described. Of course, she's described what he goes through every day. He does have to travel to the court. It is not very close to the courthouse, the Belmarsh security prison, the maximum security prison. It's about an hour and a half ride away, especially if there's traffic out there in the UK. It would take longer. And then are they monitoring the radiation levels around the x-rays? I mean, I don't know what kind of x-ray is being used. I'm not sure what kind of concern this and the state responsible for his mental state. Well, so the prison is providing the psychiatric treatment of him. He has not gone outside the facility. I don't know if that's your question that is being asked. And we have a couple questions from Jeremy about how prosecutors typically cross-examine expert defense witnesses with psychiatric mental health assessments, and how has it differed in this case? What I would tell you from my experience with this, and I covered the Chelsea Manning court-martial, is that, in that there was actually a full week-long hearing where there was allegations of unlawful pretrial punishment on the part of the Marine Corps base where she was she was held in detention at Quantico, and we heard about what happened there, how she was improperly put on suicide risk. And we had doctors that came, and those doctors have made assessments. And, in that sense, the doctors were marginalized. They weren't listened to within the military. There were officers running the brig that were, taking their own prejudices into account over the way that the doctors actually viewed Chelsea Manning's condition. I think that's what you run the risk of in these cases, is that the doctors' views get marginalized in order to fit a prejudgment that already exists. So the prosecutors, they don't want it to be unreasonable here. They don't want it to seem impractical, and that they're just saying something so that Julian Assange doesn't get extradited. So what they're trying to show the judge is that this person, is just trying to prove that Julian Assange has a deteriorated mental state, and that actually isn't based in reality. And I don't know if they've succeeded in persuading the judge one way or another, but that's certainly, you have that with the doctor in Chelsea Manning's case, where they were marginalized and they weren't listened to very much, and you have more of the wardens or the security officials are given privilege, that they're taken more seriously than the other people. If you were the defense attorney, would you have raised more objections during cross-examination today? What about previous witnesses? And that's a really I'm not going to sit here and micromanage the Assange legal team, though I appreciate the question that is put here. I'm more interested in the content of what's being brought out, and I'm also not a lawyer, so I don't know how to handle. I couldn't even begin to execute a defense for someone facing extradition to the United States. I don't really know how I would fare with. I probably wouldn't do too well, but I'm trying to give people a reference for each of the things that come out of the proceedings, so we can understand why they're significant or important. What might make them news. Not everything is an important detail. Some of them are interesting because it's, in the flow of the trial. It is kind of an interesting to see how this all unfolds. So there are little, there are different things that color what is happening in proceedings, especially when there are exchanges that happened and there are court interruptions, and like towards the end where the defense came to cross-examine the doctor and tried to get to the bottom of what the prosecution was trying to get at when it comes to this razor. And they said, we're not disputing that there was a razor that was found and that Julian Assange was concealing. So it's a mystery to me what they were trying to do. And the doctor even said that was not the impression he got. It seemed to be that they were suggesting that Julian Assange might be making up that he had a razor that he was hiding that could possibly be used to harm himself. So I guess that's not what they said, but they spent the whole cross-examination leaving that impression with the doctor. So those kinds of exchanges in the court are important to you getting a sense of the dynamic of how the judge is playing off of the defense, how the defense interacts with the judge, how the prosecution is dealing with the defense cross-examinations, which sometimes they'll pause and interrupt so that they can make points about things that are being said. And this is, will Cassandra Fairbanks be put on the stand? If so, what do you think the significance of her testimony will be? Well, for you, I would encourage you to go back to day 10. Cassandra Fairbanks' testimony was entered into the record. She will not be testifying. I did a full written report, as did a lot of other outlets cover this, that was entered into evidence about what was said to her. Arthur Schwartz, someone who worked for Richard Grenell, who was the German ambassador. Schwartz is a GOP donor. He's got close ties to Donald Trump Jr. He's been described as a fixer. I ended up adopting that term to describe him. He's somebody who threatened Cassandra Fairbanks, according to her, with retaliation after she went and met with Julian Assange and spoke with him and shared details of what she was able to learn from a direct message group that involved plans the Trump administration was going to carry out to remove Assange from the embassy. You can read all about that there. It's an important part of the Julian Assange's legal team. They're focused on this as their argument goes to whether this is a political case or not. I have a nice comment here. It was heartbreaking it's not nice. This isn't nice, but I have a heartfelt comment here. It was heartbreaking to read the proceedings today. The meanness of the prosecutor was despicable, trying to undermine the psychiatrist. That's a fair reaction. That was what James Lewis was trying to do, and spent a lot of time, I think, unfairly doing that. All right. Well, I'm going to be going, and I thank you all for following this report. I appreciate all of the support. I continue to hear from you on Twitter, and I like interacting, and all the engagement with the cases is important. Oh, let me go grab one more question here that I seem to have missed, and I got this from Jude. How much time does Julian have to communicate with his lawyers on a daily basis? Did he instruct the defense today? So every day he's been given time, and I think that they made some arrangement with the prison to try to get him there about 9:30 so that he can have some time before court starts. I have no reason to believe that that isn't happening. It hasn't been an issue raised by the legal team, so they must be getting some access to him. He does communicate. What I see now is he'll come to the glass. So he's in the glass box at the back of the room. He goes to the glass pane and he's crouching down, and he can talk through it with his team and people who are sitting in this gallery off to the side. They come to the glass and have conversations with him during breaks, and he's able to interact with them fully. And then as things do happen during proceedings, he is either interrupting to make sure that he is noticed, or he is providing notes, or he's talking to people. He's getting someone's attention so that he can have his views considered by the legal team. They do their questioning of witnesses. So I think that's the best way to answer that question. Can I see Julian's face posture? Yeah. I mean, it's a long day. It's hard to sit there for the entire court and to remain, I mean, he's not enjoying it, but he sits up and, he doesn't look any different from anybody else sitting in a court hearing, is what I would say. And then in the last week or so, he's finally was given a mask to protect him. And so that's something that he'll choose to wear now and again as he feels it's necessary. Everyone in the courtroom is wearing masks here and there as they feel it's necessary based on the risk. And I will point out that as just a wider news story outside of the Assange hearing, that Boris Johnson was announcing restrictions, 6-month restrictions for the UK today. I throw that out there. We already had a COVID scare. People didn't think it was legitimate, and it turned out to not be something where the prosecutor had the virus. However, if you look at the map right now of cases, they have spiked to 4,000. They're headed to 5,000. They're almost as high as they were in the first wave. It's safe to say that the UK finds itself in a second wave. We're wrapping this case up in the middle of this as it is escalating and increasing. I'm wondering what impact it might eventually have on the proceedings, if it's going to be disruptive at all, especially as we head into this final week of the extradition trial. It's something to keep in mind because we've had a lot of external factors bearing down upon this and making it hard to get through all the testimony. Anyways, I've overstayed my welcome here as it goes with this broadcast. So I encourage you to go to dissenter.substack.com, subscribe to that newsletter. You'll get written reports in your inbox every single day of the trial that give you, what I think was the most significant development of the day, digging into that. Then there are these reports, which you're watching, and there are the live updates. So thank you all for following. I truly appreciate all the support. So many of you are generous and you're engaged with this on a daily basis. And I will be here tomorrow on day 12 to cover the next doctors that we hear from and what they have to say about Julian Assange's medical condition.